I want to talk about a little bit, or ask you a little bit about the situation of Alberta in relationship to the federal government and the drama that's playing out in Canada, because I think that what's happening in Canada is emblematic of what's happening in the West in general, especially on the energy side. Now, one of the things you pointed out is that the provinces and the federal government have very different jurisdictions of power. And we should be clear, just so everybody understands, that the jurisdictions of power that the provinces have in Canada are not trivial. Energy and resources, health, education. Yeah, right.
Transportation.
So just those three alone, really, what you could argue, take up the bulk of what might be considered normal, important politics. And so those are provincial jurisdictions. Now, there's a reasonable amount of tension in Canada at the moment between the provinces and also between the provinces, some of the provinces and the federal government. So let's talk about province to province tension at the moment. So walk us through the equalization payment issue.
So equalization is a wealth redistribution mechanism. In fact, it's a suite of different mechanisms that happen. And some of them are formalized under this idea of transfer payments. And some of them are informal, just in the way that the federal government collects taxes and the way that they spend those taxes afterwards. But the way that it works is the idea is that some provinces at different times in history have been flush. They've been able to support their own residents because of natural resources, because of economic investment, of all sorts of different varieties. And the idea is, in spite of one province doing well, we want to make sure the entire country is able to manage. And I think most Albertans are big Canadians. They're big Westerners, and they want to see the rest of the province succeed, the rest of the provinces succeed. But increasingly, it's become really clear for Albertans for a long time now that Alberta's not getting its fair share. That increasingly we see a huge transfer, the tune of billions of dollars, leaving Alberta and not returning, collected in taxes because we have a younger population, higher employment rate, with higher salaries, working in the resource industry, that some neighboring provinces will collect those dollars in redistribution payments, but want to shut down the industry at the same time.
So there's a variety of things here that are worth delving into. So I found out, for example, that Quebec, which is the province, the French-speaking province primarily, to which the bulk of Albertan transfer payments go. And Quebec, I'm speaking, generally here, but the sentiment in Quebec is quite strongly anti-energy development. And yet their economy depends on the transfer payments that come from Alberta. And even more to the point, Quebec has enough natural gas to supply itself for 200 years, or the European Economic Bloc for 50 years. And they've decided, for one reason or another, not to develop those resources, which is a very interesting decision, especially given that they import hundreds of millions of dollars worth of natural gas from the United States, which seems relatively insane, given that it's sitting there right underneath the ground. And so this is something that actually gets my back up to quite a degree, and I don't know if I'm actually reasonable about it, because it's one thing for Albertans to transfer billions of dollars to Quebec, let's say. It's a whole other thing to do so while the Quebec population moralizes about their superiority on the environmental front, while perfectly taking the money that the energy industry is capable of producing. And it's not merely a parochial concern on my part, being an Albertan, let's say. I lived in Quebec. I loved Montreal. There's some great things about Quebec. Don't get me wrong. But their high-handed moralizing with regards to the energy industry is not one of the things that is good about Quebec. And it's also the case, you can tell me what you think about this, most of the people who are bilingual in Canada come from Quebec. And you have to be bilingual, essentially, and correct me if I've got any of this wrong, to work in the civil service. And so what that means, and I've never seen figures to lay this out statistically, is that the denizens of Quebec are radically overrepresented in Canada's version of the deep state. And that also doesn't strike me as particularly good for Alberta's interests. And so one of the things I'm curious about, and maybe this will be the most contentious part of the interview, is I don't understand why Alberta puts up with this. Like, if something radical was done, like, I know this isn't going to happen, and I'm not saying it should happen, but if Alberta said, we're done with transfer payments, what would happen?
Well, I mean, the problem is we don't collect the taxes the federal government does.
Right.
So there's only so many levers we hold. I think Albertans have said politically over and over again, we're done with being treated as second-class citizens within our own country. We're a member of the Confederation. We're a part of Canada. We're providing an economic engine so that Quebec can thrive, so that when the fisheries shut down on the East Coast, we saw thousands upon thousands of folks from Newfoundland and other parts of the Maritimes in Eastern Canada come to Alberta to work in the oil sands in Northern Alberta and Fort McMurray, to work in the oil and gas and the energy industry.
And they were welcomed.
And I have a friend who married a friend out in the East Coast, and there's this expression out in the East Coast where you're a CFA, a come from away. He's going to have grandkids that are going to own a cottage there, and they're going to be CFAs. Whereas in Alberta, you get a driver's license or a library card, you're from Alberta.
Yeah, it's a remarkably classless society.
It is.
Alberta. And I knew Rex Murphy well, and Canada's most famous Newfoundlander, and he and the people he knew, and I toured through Newfoundland with Rex, were extraordinarily grateful to Alberta for the welcome that the Newfies had when the cod fishery collapsed. And it was genuine. And I mean, I grew up at the height of the oil boom in Alberta, and I can remember the influx of people from Newfoundland. And the only friction really that ever occurred, and it wasn't friction, people told Newfie jokes. But other than that, and they weren't harsh and they weren't mean, they were funny, and Newfoundlanders have a great sense of humor by and large, so it wasn't a problem. But my experience was that Alberta really did welcome in the Newfies with open arms.
Absolutely. Many of them are just Albertans now, and we happily consider them a part of our culture and our heritage and who we are, that we're able to provide energy to so much of Canada, jobs. It's not just an economic point, and I think as a conservative and an Albertan, I need to make this clear. It's a social and a cultural point. This bound Canada together. To have two different sides that had very few common experiences. I mean, I went to Newfoundland. I couldn't understand the weather report, but being able to connect through this economic engine of the oil and gas industry in Alberta allowed us to bond together with this distant, far-flung part of the country that only joined in 1949.
There is some utility in spreading the risk. Like, you could think about the transfer payment structure if it was run fairly as a form of insurance, long-term insurance, right? So when you're doing well, then you can afford to be generous. And when you're not doing so well, then maybe another, like the manufacturing sector might be booming. Alberta, if I remember correctly, was the recipient of transfer payments at some point. Yes.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yes.
And
Alberta was also developed to some degree as a consequence of investment in the West by
McDonald and the CP rail line, of course.
So it can be a deal that works, but at the moment, there's a bunch
it's the hypocrisy that's the issue. It's the idea that...
And the money. The hypocrisy and the money.
They go hand in hand, right? I mean, Brad Wall, a former premier of Saskatchewan, said maybe Quebec will accept a pipeline if we say we'll only deliver or transfer payments through a pipeline.
Right,
You can't have one without the other. The idea of moralizing about the energy industry that provides, again, not just an economy, but Rex Murphy made this point, it saved countless marriages. It saved countless families. The carnage that happens when an economy collapses. I mean, when we see the GDP of my province go down, as the Minister of Mental Health and Addiction, I tragically see suicide rates go up.
Yes.
And this is a corollary that happens universally across the world. I mean, it's not just an economic argument. It's about the fabric of who we are as Canadians. It's about the idea that there's fairness in our confederation. This idea that you can help someone out, not just economically, but help them be able to provide for their family, save a marriage. That is meaningful collaboration. Albertans have no axe to grind with that. So many of us come from other parts of the country initially. We have a problem with the very means in which we're enabling the rest of the country to succeed is being dumped on by them in the next breath.
We should take that apart a bit more too. So